Hello everybody, it's Robin here at Toadstool Tarot, and I've been thinking a lot lately about the history and or invention and or creation of tarot. I've done a little bit of research through watching various YouTube videos on tarot history. I've done a bit of Googling and reading from different books. And what I've come up with is not all the answers, but my own sort of, we'll call it Robin's imagined history of tarot. Now, I think we have to go back quite a ways because my conclusions are the tarot has much to do with communication through oral traditions and visuals. So we go back to the very beginning, as far as we can go back, to primitive man living in caves. And we have cave paintings on the wall. These may probably even predate language, but we have images on the wall depicting stories, depicting lessons on hunting, gathering, some of the oldest means of survival and teaching the young how to survive by example. So one might consider cave paintings as flashcards for the young. They are also a way to retain stories of bravery and accomplishment by painting the images on the wall, which will last for a very long time and may last beyond languages and the changing and development of languages. Thousands of years later, we have these images still on the walls of these caves. Now, as far back as we can go in history, generally or stereotypically speaking, there were roles in the family. The male of the species were the ones that basically did all the hunting and the fighting, the defending in tribes. Civilizations gathered in tribes and lived together in caves. The men went out to hunt. They went to fight opposing tribes. The women did the gathering of foods that didn't need to be killed. They gathered plants and things to learn to weave and make clothing and other things that were needed. They did the crafting. They birthed and raised the children. They taught the youngest children the basics to survive until they were old enough to be divided into boys and girls that were old enough to either stay at home and tend the home or go out and do battle and bring home the meat. So this went on for quite a while. warring or battling tribes. Some outdid others and drove them out of their areas. We had nomadic tribes on the move, and when you move, you can't take your cave with you. So if you want to take that oral tradition with you in some sort of physical manner or means, you make those paintings on perhaps bark or stones that you can lift to carry, wood slabs, leather hides, things of this sort. So they were on the move. They were nomadic tribes, and they carried this information with them. Now we make a great leap forward, and we have the invention of paper, which I believe dates to 9th century China, which is where paper was invented. And then we also had game systems. Actually, I forgot to mention that back in cave era, besides teaching young ones to how to learn and grow from storytelling, they also probably or likely had some manner of games in the evening after they needed to stay indoors and remain safely sheltered from wilder elements. So they probably developed some manner of gaming systems. Language probably also developed through this notion of conveying imagery and teaching children, sort of labeling images with words and developing languages. So we come to China, we have the invention of paper, and we also have games, and somebody invented cards. Playing cards, playing games with pieces of paper. Next, we have movement through China and India to a group called the Mamelukes, which were in Central Asia and parts of Turkey, I believe, and they moved west into Egypt. And so there we have this sort of notion of Egyptians or gypsies on the move, and this idea of maybe the gypsies brought us tarot. Well, the Mamelukes, by way of Egypt and taking over Egypt, parts of Egypt, probably introduced the playing cards that they used in their gambling games to the nomadic tribes in Egypt, who adopted them and moved along with them, taking them to Europe. We're jumping way ahead. This is into the 1400s. We've got them in Italy. They come to Italy, and there are card-playing games in Italy. We have various types of games, various types of cards, and we have what predates tarot, and we have many games that are developing. We have games that are divided into groups called the major arcana, or, well, they probably weren't called the major arcana then, the trumps or triumphi, and then we have the minor arcana. So we have a real division there, and this is kind of what got me curious and started to think about this idea of how did tarot start. because I look at old Tarot de Marseille decks, and there's something about the majors and minors that doesn't gel to me. It feels like the majors and courts are picture cards, and the minors are illustrated pips. And this seems like two completely different systems that were sort of pushed together, forced together, that really never belonged together. That got me curious about the whole thing. And I'm particularly fond of major arcana decks that exclude the minors. It's got me thinking about that. Well, in many cases later, we had a sort of an evolution or a dividing of the two. We have, in some areas of Europe, France in particular, many major arcana decks that don't include the minors, and then we have playing cards all over the world that don't include the majors. They just have the pips. So I'm thinking about these nomadic tribes through Egypt and Central Europe that started moving about. And we know through some history into the 1400s that card production was a rather expensive thing to do. And we have printing presses, and we have hand-painted cards. We have things that were very expensive, to which only the upper classes could afford. And probably poorer groups were drawing or hand-making their own cards if they could find paper or cardstock to draw or paint on in the wee hours of the night in their traveling wagons by candlelight. And I suspect that even though cartomancy predates tarot by possibly a few hundred years, a lot of this came about through what we might call or refer to as entertainment. I'm not really sure about the cartomancy aspect, how one went from a deck of gambling game cards to developing pictures and stories. But I imagine the earliest pictures and stories probably came from the nomadic mothers of these moving tribes entertaining the children in the evening by the fire by telling them stories and conveying those stories through images on the cards. The cards at some point when they were hand painted by monks for, or for wealthy upper class people, they started depicting religious lessons from the Bible and other holy books. They depicted the classes, various modes of behavior and activities of man in society, their place, their rank in society. And various decks had various numbers of cards in them and different labels to cards. So at some point there was an evolution to 22 cards. It was actually 21, and then an additional card marked 0 for the Fool was added to make it 22. That came later. But how those cards were decided or determined, how the number was determined to 21 or 22 is rather curious, and I suspect that came later, around the time when cards began to be conceived of as something beyond gambling games and more akin to divination methods or prospects. There were several figures in Europe, in France. The earliest one, I believe, was in the 1700s. The name was Court. Was it Antoine? I think Antoine Court, or Antoine Court de Gabelin, who claimed to have been taught a divination system from an Italian. So these cards, or this earliest notion of divination by tarot, probably came from an Italian man, and I would not be surprised if it was an Italian from one of these nomadic tribes of people moving on, which generally speaking were the lower classes. The nomadic tribes were strangers in town, driven out, unwelcome. When you think about towns and villages and cities, you have people that know each other, people that are familiar, that build bonds and friendships and help defend each other against outsiders. You have limited resources. Everybody has their part in the community, and when you have strangers coming through, they're suspect. They're outsiders. They're living by their wits. They may take from you. They'll do anything they have to do to survive and feed their families. They're very clever. Here we get this sort of unpleasant stereotype of gypsies who steal, so on and so forth. I think you get the idea of the upper classes. We have the upper classes who could afford to have servants and pay the lower classes or enslaved lower classes to do the menial work for them, and then they had lots of time to pursue entertainment or self-pleasure. So they ended up, finding things to entertain them. And we only need to look back to things like royal houses where kings and queens employed jokers, jesters to entertain. So I suspect the most clever or keen-witted of these nomadic tribes sought ways to become more valuable to the upper classes by offering forms of entertainment. And what better way to entertain than to tell stories? We go back, part of the reason I thought of this was the old Arabian Night tale of Scheherazade, who married a king who had a wife for each night, and then she was beheaded. And Scheherazade had heard about this, and she decided that she would start to weave these fabulous tales for 1,001 Nights to the king who married her. And she would have him so fascinated with the story, and she would leave off, just late at night with a sort of a cliffhanger, such that he wanted to know how the story would come out. So he'd let her live another day, and then she'd tell more the next night and the next night, and so on. And she managed to save her own life by using her wits and telling these stories to entertain her husband. and thereby survive. Well, these nomadic tribes move their way up into the wealthier classes by entertaining or earning keep by entertaining the wealthier classes with stories. Stories about what? Stories about adventure and things that entertain, but also finding ways to feed their egos by telling them things about themselves, mysteries revealed, things that they might want to know about fortune or adventure. And so they invented these stories related to these images that they could basically con the upper classes with, use their wits about them in order to put food on the table and survive. I suspect at some point there crossed over the notice that some images seem to signal symbols and stories that had particular meaning or significance related to survival and rules and laws and how to behave and what to believe and how best to go through life to gain advantage. So these stories came out of these visuals in the cards, and there became a sequence of 0 to 22 we call the Fool's Journey, and it tells a story. And I imagine once being printed on paper, maybe it was compiled originally into a book, but before they were bound into a book, maybe a monk who had hand-painted them moved across the workshop floor and tripped, and the pages all went flying. Maybe when they were gathered up, they were recombined, and it was discovered that different ordering of the pages provided different stories. So there we have a possibility of the invention from a book that could be bound and carried to individual cards that could be recombined and tell different stories. Thereby you have not only one book, you have millions of books in one stack of images. So at some point it wasn't until, I believe, the 1800s that we sort of have official divination by tarot cards that were studied in occultists that were delving into magic and spirituality and involving Kabbalah and Hebrew letters and various systems. And so the development of tarot as a system filled with symbols that are magical seems like a relatively late invention. And we have what was basically printed and distributed as gaming cards became in the 1800s divination cards to entertain at parties and group gatherings. And we have various systems being expanded on or revised and changed in the late 1800s. We have the Oswald Worth cards. We have, of course, the Tarot de Marseille, which had been sort of transformed or rethought, studied and reformed. We have the original deck published by Atea or Aliette. And then we have the Order of the Golden Dawn, who decided to look at them in a new way and create a deck that was fully illustrated scenic cards, arriving around 1909 and illustrated by Pamela Coleman Smith, which we all know about because they took over the world in popularity. And then it wasn't until the 40s that we had the Aleister Crowley, Frida Harris deck come out, or printed, I should say, designed. I believe it actually might not have been printed until the 1950s or 60s. But anyway, mostly what we think of as tarot is from the late 1800s through the 1900s. Prior to that, it was more or less gaming cards and not for divination. This is my own notion of how tarot came to be, and I still don't have all the answers because I'm still trying to research how various symbols and orders and label names were introduced, or how they led to depictions the way they were. I recently saw a video that indicated sacred geometry that was assigned to the 22 original cards that had to do with geometric figures containing certain numbers of equal sides. So we had, originally we had the triangle, then the square, then the pentagram, then the hexagon, and so on and so forth. It goes up until we had 21 with, I don't recall how many sides. It wasn't every number. They had to be an equal number of sides. And then the 22nd card, being labeled the Fool, was 0, which basically is a circle. And the circle is the closest to 360 1-degree angles all the way around a figure, which looks more like a circle than it does a line-related geometric figure. So that's intriguing. I don't know exactly how someone arrived at that. There's still a lot of answers there, and how certain visual figures in the tarot mimicked these geometric figures. For instance, the magician was card number 1. It was the triangle, and he's sort of positioned in this triangular pose. The square was the high priestess, who was sort of in a squarish or rectangular kind of shape, and so on. The empress is sort of laid out with her head, her elbows, and her legs in this sort of pentagonal shape. It's interesting to look at. And so there are lots of interesting things in there to pursue. And there's still a lot of mysteries there to solve. And some of them, I think, may have been disclosed along the way, some of them invented along the way. Some of the histories say that the cards came from the gypsies. Some say they came from the Knights Templar. Some say they came from the ancient Egyptians. There are so many different myths and legends and stories out there, but these are the connections that I've drawn or invented so far that make some sort of sequence of events throughout history, from cave days to modern times, where we now have a book of 1,000,000 books in a little box that we can carry with us everywhere and use as guidance, and sometimes some people use to foretell for future events or current events. Some still use them for games. There are many reasons for tarot, many uses for tarot, and it's all very interesting to keep learning. And if you have any extra information or links to other historical videos, please include them in the comments below. I have a Facebook page for Toadstool Tarot. I have copied a few links there to videos on tarot history that you can have a look at from other channels. I should make a list of reading material books. If you have any that you think are particularly informative or significant, definitely include those in the comments as well. Tarot is a lifelong learning process that I'm enjoying, and I think much of the community is also enjoying. So I thank you for indulging me today and Robin's history of the origins of tarot. And I hope to see you all again soon. Take care.